Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer lore video on the city of Marienburg. Here you can see the coat of arms of Marienburg, as many of you who will have played an Empire campaign will recognize, and perhaps just know the city for the tremendous amount of gold one can have for it. But I think I'd give you guys all a little bit of context as to why Marienburg potentially generates so much money in the game, and the story behind that. So here we see the game's coat of arms for Marienburg, and here we see what it was like before. Apologies for the slightly blurry image, it's the best one I could find. But as you can see, it's essentially the same thing with the mermaid, the sword, the purse, but surrounded by two seahorses, which I thought was a nice little touch as well. Marienburg itself is located at the westernmost point of the empire, as you can see circled there in this mock-up of the game map. It was founded in the year of the imperial calendar -10. Now, it was founded by a chap called the Fenwolf King, who, upon sort of marching through the sort of wasteland and the marsh, discovered standing walls of an elven ruin at the mouth of the River Reich. Now, for those of you who don't know quite how the calendar works, essentially the game itself and the Warhammer Fantasy Universe is set around the year 2501, 502, around that kind of period. But it's based around the appearance of Sigmar, who is essentially a man who became a god to the people of the Empire. I won't get too much into detail of that, but his arrival is essentially how they base their calendar. So Marienburg roughly founded about 2,500 years before the present day in the Total War Warhammer Universe. And here we can see the city of Marienburg from a slightly different map. I think this is an older map of the Warhammer before the game came out. But you can see, I just wanted to give the idea that it's very much surrounded by marshes and terrible land. Just give you a bit of an idea about the outlay of the rest of the Westerlands. Now, in the year 501, a chap called Sigismund II, who was emperor at the time, known also as Sigismund the Conqueror, marched in and took the sort of wastelands from people called the Jutos. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that quite correctly, but I think that's how it's said. And he founded the province of Westerland. Now, he also went on to greatly expand the empire as it stood at the time, conquering what was then not Empire land of Averland, going south and taking large sections of the Border Prince's territory, as well as conquering areas which would go on to belong to Bretonnia. But eventually, Sigismund passed away and some parts of the empire fell into other people's hands. Westland, however, stayed solidly in the empire's hands for a very long time. And because it it was essentially the mouth to the ocean of every river within the empire, it linked most of the empire. It was the sort of connecting point of most of the empire's trade. Now, in this time, Marienburg really went on to prosper greatly. It began to sort of rise like a behemoth out of the water. Huge towers started to appear, but it was all built around these small islands. The surrounding land was completely marshland, and there were only these small islands that stood as solid ground one could build on. No one quite understood why this was. It has been suspected because it was built upon the ruins of an old elvish city, that it's actually elven high magic that keeps the islands of Marienburg afloat and not just sinking into the marsh. Now, Marienburg itself, you need to imagine as kind of a Venice/lake town from Lord of the Rings. Some parts of it have lovely older buildings, while others are essentially just shanty towns built upon wooden bridges or wooden pallets that are just sitting on parts of the river or built on bridges. Now, as I said, huge wealth started to flow into Marienburg, allowing the construction of towers. Here's a bit of a model representation of what Marienburg's like in the old Warhammer Fantasy game, and a little bit of an early sketch of what Marienburg would have looked like before. Now, most of Marienburg's wealth, as I said, was from trade. Not only the fact that it connected parts of the empire to each other and allowed a common place of trade, but also you'd get trade from the Dark Elves of Naggaroth. You'd get trade from the High Elves of Ulthuan. You'd get trade from even further south in the New World, from maybe not directly the lizard people, but through traders who might go down there and trade with them. And essentially it's all leading into this one entrance to the Empire, which is Marienburg. And for this reason, Marienburg very much became a sort of cultural hub. You wouldn't be surprised to see a lizard man necessarily in Marienburg. People of all races, colors, creeds, you'd see them everywhere. There'd be elves living in Marienburg. There'd be people from Araby, people from Nippon. There'd be multitudes of languages spoken there. It would really be a huge cultural hub of the empire as it stood. Now, with all this wealth going on, you got certain merchants and certain merchant families becoming extremely powerful within the city. And they'd each have sort of their own land they built on, obviously land being a very high value commodity in Marienburg due to not being a lot of good construction land around. So how would people build out? Well, they couldn't, so they built up. So this is why you get sort of the tallest buildings in the empire coming out of Marienburg. The wealthiest families, obviously wanting to show off their wealth, building up the highest towers. So you'd get sort of 20-foot high towers where you wouldn't see anywhere else in the empire. Is not an uncommon sight in Marienburg itself. Now, as I said, so the height of these towers would be very much a sign of a family's prosperity and wealth. Life would very much go on to be continuously prosperous as part of the Westerland in Marienburg, part of the empire very much, until the year that is Imperial Calendar 2429. So roughly around 2,000 years, Marienburg's been part of the empire and has prospered greatly and has become a real hub, a hugely important city within the empire itself. And then comes the reign of Dieter IV. Previously, his family had ruled Stirland. He was known as a terrible empire, really. He'd kind of left the empire in disarray. He was based out of Nuln, which was the capital at the time, and he spent a lot of his money on sort of projects of ego, building up golden statues of himself, building up a building which became known as the Golden Palace at the time, just completely frivolous spending while the empire and its defense fell apart. And he'd skimp on army aspects and things like that. He also would build things, sort of slightly luxury buildings like the Imperial Zoo, where a number of the famous mounts of the current heroes of the Empire get their animals from. For example, Balthazar's Gelt's Pegasus, he gets out of the Imperial Zoo when he needs it from time to time. And so, due to this ill management of the Empire, a goblin started to emerge in the south of the Empire called Grom the Paunch. Now, this was a goblin who grew to enormous size. He started out as a normal-sized goblin, but on a dare, he ate a bit of an ogre. And because ogres regenerate, the flesh of the ogre started to regenerate within Grom's stomach, which started to affect him and made him grow and made his belly grow. And when most goblins would explode after eating a troll, Grom perhaps had some particularly strong digestive juices or whatever his trait is, but he managed to survive it. He led a war on the Empire, which essentially managed to take huge swaths of territory, including ransacking at the time Nuln, which was the imperial capital. Now, Dieter IV was stacked up in Nuln, but when he saw Grom approaching, he left and became very much known as the Emperor who ran away. Eventually, he needed to raise an army to defeat Grom, but it wasn't him who did it in the end. It was the Count of Reichland at the time, a chap called Wilhelm. And he became a hero of the Empire for fighting back this greenskin invasion, and again, very much undermining the position of Dieter. Now, for whatever reason, to try and maybe earn back his name through some great construction or whatever, he felt he needed a huge sum of money. And this led the merchant guilds and richest merchant families of Marienburg to approach him and say, basically, look, here is, and it's only ever described as an astonishing amount of wealth. And for an empire to find an astonishing amount of wealth, one has to assume it was a huge payout day for him. And they said, look, let us be in an independent city, and you can have this amount of wealth to do whatever projects you want. And he took the deal. And this image, in fact, is him signing that very deal in the now capital of Altdorf. Now, the rest of the empire and the provincial counts were furious by this move. They were enraged. And promptly within the same year, they dethroned him as emperor and placed the conqueror of the Greenskins, Wilhelm, who went on to become known as Wilhelm the Wise, at the time the Count of Reichland, as the emperor. And in fact, he was the Count of Reichland, and I think since him, all the Counts of Reichland have been emperors, leading to who we start off with in the game under an Empire campaign of Karl Franz. So with him disposed, Marienburg went on to become a completely independent nation and started to run itself. Here's a map of what Marienburg looks like today. The main parts of Marienburg, sort of the important locations, are the island of Reichke's Isle, where a lot of the buildings seem to be, sort of most important buildings seem to be placed, as it's the sort of central point of the city. Now, a couple of places of note is there is essentially an elf embassy. They call it an exchangerate, but essentially an elf embassy in Marienburg, which sort of deals with all the trade that the elves of Ulthuan, not the dark elves, I don't think their embassy would be full of slaves and murdering people, but the high elves have built there. And they, that in fact, is the only outpost that the elves have outside of Ulthuan, which I thought was an interesting point about the city. Other areas include the Temple Wick. I'd never know how to say that properly, but the Temple Wick area, where a number of the religious temples of Reichland are based. They play an important role because there are several temples. The Temple of Manan, the Temple of Heinrich, the Temple of Verena, and the Temple of Shalea. And each of those heads of temples play a part in the ruling council of Marienburg. Now, this council is made up of those high priests of each of those temples and the rector of the College of Baron Heinrich. Now, this is quite an interesting college. Essentially, it's a naval and magic school. So what you have is some oceanic magics are taught. Now, there's not a lot of people who go into a lot of detail about that in the Warhammer lore, and it's not really a recognized wind of magic, as it were, but I imagine it's just people being able to manipulate tides and waves to facilitate sailing, essentially. Now, apart from these high priests, there is also something known as the heads of, well, imaginatively named, the heads of 10, which is essentially the heads of the 10 wealthiest families in Marienburg. So essentially sort of a leading council who guide the city and make its decisions. Now, in terms of the religions, the temples I've met, I don't know if you guys have heard about them. Obviously, within the Empire, the main person of worship is Sigmar, but other religions also supported. For example, Middenheim has their own god that they worship. But the 4 temples of Marienburg are the gods of Manan, and just to give you a bit of a rundown of who he is, he's essentially the imperial god of the sea. His sign is the albatross. He essentially is, as far as they're concerned, rule over all things ocean-related, kind of a Poseidon-like figure. You also have Heinrich, who is the god of legal trade and making a profit. Now, he has some sort of, I wouldn't call them, I'd call them sort of guidelines that he implores his worshippers to follow. The number one of them, sort of testament, I think one could maybe call it, is make a profit every day. Number 1 point. Number 2 point, if a partnership is formed, always make sure an oath is sworn. 3rd point, give charitably, but within reason. 5th point, never use violence for gain. And 6th point, don't get caught in a lie until you leave town. So very much trader and commercial focused. There is rumor he's often mistaken for a god called Ranald, but apparently Ranald is the god of illegal trade and smuggling and all things nefarious, so very untoward and obviously wouldn't be necessarily openly worshipped in Marienburg. Now, Verena essentially is the goddess of knowledge, science, law, and justice, And she very much looks like our Western representation of justice, with the blindfold and the scales, and that's essentially who she is. Now, we have Shalea, who's also known as the White Dove of Mercy, who likes to bring mercy and comfort. So, essentially, like, all her temples double as hospitals. If you can't afford a physician, you end up at one of them. And I think there's maybe some slight undertone suggestions that if you're beyond help, they might just kill you and, spare you pain mercifully. But that's who Shalea is. Now, moving on to Marienburg and its armies. Marienburg doesn't really have it's never had an army book as far as I'm aware, but very much like Estalia and Tilia, it's very reliant on mercenaries, and particularly pirate mercenaries and things of that nature. So if they were ever in conflict with anyone, they'd hire in some mercenaries. They've even been known to rent steam tanks off of the Empire itself in a time of conflict. Obviously, highly guarded by the Empire, and they're run by the Empire's own people, and they would never let anyone from Marienburg get near the engineering of it. So, but Marienburg, seeing steam tanks, was so highly impressed by their use. They actually invented, something I really hope makes it into the Total War Warhammer game at some point. They wanted a steam tank of their own. So they contacted some members of the Imperial Gunnery College at Nulun and were like, "Hi guys, we essentially have infinite cash. Can you please build us some steam tanks of our own?" And most of the people in the Imperial College were like, no, we're not going to do that for you. But they found a few people whose heads they could turn for a little bit of cash. And one has to assume maybe not the most highly respected engineers in the Empire, but people who were smart enough to be within the Gunnery College anyway. And essentially after about, I think, a number of years of them sort of shelling out money after money after money, good money chasing bad, as it were, Marienburg started to get frustrated and were like, "This is ridiculous. We've wasted so much money on this project. We don't have something to show for it." And the people who were working on it in the Gunnery College didn't know the secrets of the steam tank itself, and they couldn't figure out how the boiler for the steam tank was so small and produced so much power. They just couldn't replicate it. They were absolutely stuck. So what they did was, essentially this guy came along who was working on the project called Hezekiah Gutman, also known by the nickname the Burnt Scarecrow. I assume that's because he blew up a lot, sort of in that cartoon style way, one has to imagine. But anyway, Hezekiah had this idea and goes, "Look, if we can't make a boiler that size, let's just make it huge. Let's just make it the size it needs to be for us to be able to get it to work." And in a stroke of ego, he was like, "Okay, so what body are we going to put this in?" And a stroke of genius, I meant to say, he wanted to stroke the ego of the Marienburg people and their love of boats and the ocean. And so he came up with this monstrosity, the land battleship. And it was huge. And essentially, it couldn't carry as much weight as a steam tank, so they had to put smaller cannons on it. But it was still a siege engine that could get about. I mean, it was relatively impressive compared to just a cannon, but nothing compared to the ingenuity that is the steam tank itself. Now, he just went, "Okay, here you go. Here's your engine," thinking that Marienburg would order maybe one or two. They ended up ordering, I think, about 15 of them, and which took these guys completely by surprise. They could barely fill the orders as they were sending them along. And as I said, very much an inferior machine to the steam tank, but I think it looks fantastic and a little bit hilarious at the same time. And certainly intimidating if you saw that sort of coming towards you on a battlefield. But if they ever do bring in like a mercenary army or sort of a Dogs of War army, as has existed in Warhammer in the past, for Marienburg, it would be great to see this unit on the battlefield as well. It has been modeled in the past, so you never know, it might show up. Here's a sort of picture of the model as it stood a while ago, with the massive steam engine back. A little bit of a funny anecdote about this was once they sent like the first 5 or 6 across to Marienburg, Nulun itself came under attack. There wasn't really an army to help them out at the time, so they asked Marienburg for help. And they said, "Marienburg, can we please use some of your land battleships?" And Marienburg were delighted to oblige for a price. Of course, for a price. Marienburgers make a profit every day, as their god says. And here's another picture of the model, which I really hope can make it into the Total War Warhammer game at some point. As a final point on Marienburg, I just wanted to clear up why now on the Total War Warhammer map and on other Warhammer Fantasy maps you'll see around the place, the province is now called the Wasteland rather than Westerland, as it was known when it was part of the Empire. Well, essentially, it was a nickname that caught on amongst the gentry and the sort of peasantry of the Empire. So miffed were they that Marienburg had purchased its freedom from the runaway emperor, that they decided to call the province the Wasteland. Slightly descriptive of some of the worst and swampier parts of the province, but also really more as a bugger-you to those merchants who bought their independence from the Empire. So just a sort of final insult. Doesn't really make up for the fact that they lost one of the most prosperous cities in the old world, but you know what? Good for them, getting their own back in the smallest of ways. And really that sums up my lore video for Marienburg. If you did like it, please leave a like. And if you'd like to see more, drop any suggestions below, even though it's for sort of legendary lords or other places within the Empire or within the Total War game that you'd like to have a bit more background on. Let me know. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure to make, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks very much, and do subscribe if you want to see more. And till next time.